That island that you see in the lake near Harrenhal is actually one of the most important locations in Westeros. It's called the Isle of Faces, and it was mentioned very early on in the first book, A Game of Thrones. It's one of those locations in the story that's been built up and is probably important in the endgame, but we've never seen it up close yet. Many people expected that we would get to see it in the later seasons of Game of Thrones, but because they sort of sidelined the entire magical Weirwood plotline, we never actually got to figure out what's going on there. Many fans assume that it will have something to do with the endgame for Bran and the Weirwoods and the White Walkers, but we really don't know yet what exactly is even going on the Isle of Faces. It's said to be inhabited by the Green Men, but we really don't even know what they are or what they look like. Old Nan has told the Stark children stories about the Green Men. Catelyn thinks about how the Isle of Faces is where the Green Men keep their silent watch, and even north of the Wall, there's a wildling who Jon meets who says that when he gets south of the Wall, the number one thing on his to-do list is to go visit the Green Men on the Isle of Faces, which means that even north of the Wall, where they've been cut off from the south for so long that they don't know what a windmill is, they know about the Isle of Faces and they know that the Green Men live there. That's a very important location to the Old Ways religion. Now, this wildling who says that to Jon is known as Grig the Goat, and he's probably going to have a difficult time getting to the Isle of Faces, even if he does make it that far south. The Isle of Faces is somewhere that is generally unable to be visited. The Green Men have a spell over the place, the equivalent of a magical no soliciting sign. Anyone who shows up is driven away by strange currents, very strong sudden winds, or potentially even a flock of angry ravens that drives them away. So no one is really ever allowed to step on the island. There are a few exceptions to this rule over the years. One of the people who supposedly was allowed to visit the Isle of Faces was Howland Reed. We're told about this in the main story, but we also haven't met Howland Reed yet, so we haven't gotten to learn what he talked about with the Green Men. We do, however, have an old draft of a chapter from George that we can compare with the published version to get a little bit more info on what he's thinking about when it comes to the Isle of Faces. For those of you who don't know, George R. R. Martin sends a lot of his old drafts to a library down in Texas called the Cushing Library, and basically they're kept there as an archive and people can go and look through them. So some fans have done just that and they've posted their findings on Reddit. I've got an entire video breaking down like an hour's worth of changes and what I think they could potentially mean. The interesting change related to what we're talking about today, though, is the wording chosen for when Howland Reed left the Isle of Faces. In the published version, it says he said his goodbyes to the Green Men, but in the unpublished version, it says that he said his goodbyes to the trees. Now, this is some interesting wording because as the fans have tried to figure out what exactly the Green Men are, one of the big connections is that they are in some way or another connected to these magical trees. There are weirwoods at the Isle of Faces that are ancient and apparently very magically important. They were there to witness the pact itself, so there is obviously something of great importance going on with the trees on the Isle of Faces. And of course, up at the wall, when Bran and company passed through the Black Gate, we did see a giant talking weirwood face that seems to be built into the wall itself. So if there are giant talking weirwood faces, Howland saying goodbye to the trees could be very literal. The other thing that we see north of the wall is when we find Bloodraven up in his cave, he is entwined with the roots of a weirwood tree, making him sort of a half tree, half man, called a green seer. Could the Green Men be similar to green seers and be merged with trees like this on some level, thus explaining why Howland saying goodbye to the Green Men and saying goodbye to the trees could sort of be interchangeable lines? You can see how there's a ton of fun speculation to be had here, and this definitely isn't the first video on my channel about the Isle of Faces. But there's something that I really think we need to talk about now, because I think House of the Dragon might be setting us up for a reveal of further information about this location. The thing that I would like to draw your attention to as a little bit of foreshadowing is the chair that Daemon has been sitting in when he's at Harrenhal. It has a very interesting carving on the back of it. It appears to be some sort of knight sitting on a throne that looks an awful lot like the Iron Throne, except for the fact that it's made from a tree. So where the Iron Throne has a bunch of swords sticking up, you have the branches of the tree growing out, but the person is sitting on the throne made from the tree itself. This imagery really makes me think of the Oaken Seat, the throne of the old ruling family of the Reach, the Gardeners. It was a living throne carved directly out of an oak tree, and the oak tree itself was said to be planted by Garth Greenhand. an ancient green man figure in Westeros. We get a lot of interesting imagery of tree thrones in our story, from the weirwood root thrones that the Green Seers have to this oaken seat, and considering because of the television show we know that Bran is going to end up as king and he is obviously very related to the trees, it does make a lot of sense that perhaps Bran will end up sitting on a tree-style throne rather than the Iron Throne in the end of the story. Considering all the buildup we have around the Green Men and the Isle of Faces, it does make some sense that perhaps if Bran Stark needs a new sort of magical tree planted to become his throne for a future age of Westeros, maybe the Green Men would be the right ones to plant it, and perhaps that could be the role of the Isle of Faces in our main story. I've already put out an entire video talking about how I think the Isle of Faces is on some level or another a magical seed vault, so if they're coming out to potentially help plant a new world tree after a lot of bad things happen during the long night, well then potentially this new world tree could also be carved into a throne for Bran that looks very similar to what we see on the back of this chair at Harrenhal. So maybe that's all that this is. Maybe the only reason we have this artwork on the back of the chair is to have some in-world lore building, some references to the Oaken seat and the way that things used to be in the Reach. Or perhaps it's just there so that when the final books come out, in hindsight, we'll get to look back and see, hey, that looks a lot like the throne that Bran ends up sitting on. That's kinda cool, what a little neat connection. But I want to talk about what I think is the most exciting option. This is actually foreshadowing for something that we're about to see in House of the Dragon itself. Now, this is the part that may contain the most minor of spoilers for House of the Dragon, but this is something that is like rumored to happen in the world book that we don't really know any of the details behind, so I'm not actually going into any real spoilery details, and the little bit that's actually a spoiler I'm going to phrase in the least spoilery way possible, but this is your warning if you want to be completely in the dark about everything. So, in the World Book, one of the things that is rumored to happen is a character apparently goes to the Isle of Faces and talks to the Green Men. Now, there is a world in which House of the Dragon would decide we're not going to depict that, we're not going to worry about the Isle of Faces. That's what Game of Thrones did in the later seasons. Obviously, the Isle of Faces is set up for some importance, and they decided we're just not going to go down that route. They left out a lot of the creepy Weirwood magic, they left out the Isle of Faces. I could have seen a world where House of the Dragon did the same thing. But if you've been watching House of the Dragon Season 2, you will know they are very much not leaving out the creepy Weirwood magic. And with all of the little foreshadowing and setup for the Isle of Faces and the Weirwood creepiness that's all going on, I'm growing more and more confident that we are actually going to see this character go and visit the Isle of Faces, and we might actually get to finally see what the Green Men look like. If they do eventually show us this scene in House of the Dragon, it could arguably be the most consequential lore drop that the show could possibly give us. What the Green Men are and what they look like is a mystery that fantasy fans have been wondering about since literally the 90s. If House of the Dragon really wants to break the brains of much of the Song of Ice and Fire community and break our little corner of the internet for several days, all they would have to do is actually just give us a full-on reveal of these Green Men. A reveal which is directly from the source material and is sitting right in front of them for them to do if they want to. I really don't think they're going to pass this opportunity up. So if they want to set up this reveal and they are planning to show us the Green Men later on in the show, one thing that would probably make a lot of sense for them to do is to foreshadow the appearance of the Green Men. And I think that could be what they're doing with the back of this chair. As I said at the beginning, there are definitely some different options for what the Green Men could look like based on what we've been told in the books, but one of the options is definitely sitting on these oaken seat style thrones and potentially entwined with these magical trees by this point, essentially half tree and half man. So, if that's what they end up looking like, it would make a lot of sense that this chair is basically foreshadowing that. It's showing us what the green men look like sitting on their tree thrones, but in a stylized version that doesn't have them like completely intertwined with the things in the way that they might end up being by now. Basically, we may look back at this chair and think, oh my god, that's what the green men look like on the Isle of Faces. In the same way that we look back at this little island that we see in the foreground as Damon swoops into Harrenhal and recognize, oh my god, what an important location. This is all stuff that is little setup that could be for a big payoff in the future if House of the Dragon does eventually decide to show us the Isle of Faces in detail. So I look forward to seeing some interesting discussion about all of this down in the comments. Do you think that the back of that chair is a green man from the Isle of Faces, or do you think it's potentially just the oaken seat, or do you think it's something else that I didn't bring up in this video? Do you agree with me that based on what we're seeing in House of the Dragon Season 2, they are looking more likely to lean into the creepy weirwood magic and the Isle of Faces and all of that, and therefore I think that they are very likely to show us what's going on there. How likely do you think it is that we get some major lore reveals around the Isle of Faces, and do you have any predictions for what we might see there if we do indeed get to go? This is one of the little things that House of the Dragon seems to be foreshadowing that definitely has me the most hyped, and there will obviously be a lot more to talk about once we've seen the entirety of Season 2, so make sure you're subscribed for that, and make sure to like the video if you haven't already. I will definitely be talking about all of this stuff again in the future, but today I just wanted to give this little minimal spoilers discussion about why so many people are so hyped about seeing that little island in the foreground as we see Harrenhal, and why so many people like me are getting so hype over just a quick little shot of the back of a broken chair. That chair, as well as how much they seem to be emphasizing the Isle of Faces, feel like they're setting up for a major reveal of some lore that A Song of Ice and Fire fans have been wondering about for literally decades, and I think that is pretty cool. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back with something else very soon.